They threw away 12 years of his life in a single afternoon, packed into 8 cardboard boxes, and left on the sidewalk outside his office, like someone's unwanted furniture. The woman who authorized it was 29 years old and had been running Caldwell Precision Engineering for 11 months. She'd inherited the company the way some people inherit furniture, without asking for it, without fully understanding what it contained, and with a vague sense that most of it needed to go. Her name was Audrey Caldwell. She signed the termination order on a Thursday, without looking up from her phone. The man whose name was on that order stood in the parking lot of the building he'd worked in since he was 26, and looked at his boxes, and didn't move for a long time. His name was James Holt. He was 38 years old, and he had a daughter at home waiting for him, and he had nothing to say about any of it that he trusted himself to say out loud. He loaded the boxes into his truck. He drove home. He made dinner because Sophie was 6 and needed dinner, and the world had not stopped requiring things of him just because it had also stopped making sense. That was 3 years ago. Now he ran a garage on the edge of Millhaven, a town of 12,000 in the flatlands of central Ohio, where the winters came early and the roads were hard on engines. The garage was called Holt Auto. The sign was hand-painted and slightly crooked because he'd put it up himself on a windy afternoon and hadn't wanted to wait for a better day. The work was different from what he'd done at Caldwell, simpler in some ways, more honest in others. People brought him things that were broken and trusted him to fix them, and he did, and they paid him, and that was the whole transaction. Nobody reassigned his work to a committee. Nobody told him the project was being restructured. Nobody smiled at him in meetings and then removed his name from the documents. He was 38 when he left Caldwell. He was 41 now. Sophie was 9 and had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, which was either a gift or a problem, depending on the day. She came home from school at 3:40 and dropped her backpack inside the garage door with a thud that announced her the way other children announce themselves, with noise. Sophie announced herself with weight. She appeared at his shoulder while he was underneath a Chevy Silverado belonging to a man named Garrett, who had been coming to the garage for 2 years and still spelled his name wrong on the checks. "There's a woman in the parking lot," Sophie said. "I'll be right out. She's just standing there. She has a good car." "Sophie, I'm just describing the situation." He came out from under the truck and wiped his hands and walked to the front of the garage. A black sedan was parked at the edge of the gravel lot. The woman leaning against it was looking at her phone. She was young, younger than he'd expected from the voice on the voicemail she'd left that morning. Professional and clipped, and carrying the specific cadence of someone who was used to being the one who set the terms. He'd almost deleted it without calling back. He had a rule about unknown numbers, and a separate rule about anything connected to Caldwell Precision Engineering, and she had triggered both. He'd called back anyway. He wasn't entirely sure why. She looked up when she heard the crunch of gravel under his boots. She was maybe 30, dark-haired, wearing a blazer that cost more than his monthly electric bill, and shoes that were practical enough to walk in, but expensive enough to be taken seriously. She had the posture of someone who had been told her whole life to stand up straight and had eventually stopped noticing she was doing it. "Mr. Holt," she said. "Miss Caldwell," he said. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the recognition that he'd done the research, same as she had. "You know who I am. I recognized the company when you called. After that, it wasn't hard." She looked at him steadily. "I'd like to talk to you about the Meridian project." He looked back at her the same way. "You're standing on my property asking me to talk about work I did for a company that fired me by mail." "I know. Then you understand why I might not be eager." "I do," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Behind him, Sophie was absolutely not listening from just inside the garage door, which he knew because he knew his daughter. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." The Meridian project had been his, all of it. 3 years of his life, a proprietary diagnostic system that could identify mechanical failures in industrial equipment before they occurred, not during inspection, not after breakdown, but before, by reading the specific frequency signatures that components produced in the hours before they gave out. He'd built the core algorithm on his own time, before Caldwell even knew he was working on it. He'd brought it to them because it needed hardware, testing infrastructure, a team. He'd believed, at 35, that bringing your best work to people who could help it become real was how things worked. He'd been wrong about that in the specific way that people are wrong about things they want very much to believe. He set a mug in front of Audrey Caldwell and sat across from her at the small table in the back of the garage that served as his office. Sophie had retreated to the house, or more accurately, had retreated to the window that looked out onto the garage, which she believed was not visible from inside the garage. It was visible from inside the garage. The Meridian diagnostic system is in 7 of our facilities, Audrey said. It's been operational for 2 years. Last year it flagged 43 failures before they occurred. The estimated cost savings from prevented downtime was $11.4 million, James said. She stopped. I've kept track, he said. Your quarterly reports are public. She looked at him. Then you also know that the system's documentation lists the development credit as internal R&D. No individual attribution. I know. Your name is nowhere in it. I know that too. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Her hands, he noticed, were very still. The hands of someone who had learned to control what they expressed. I took over the company 11 months ago. My father died in March of last year. Heart attack, his office, 63 years old. He was on a call with a supplier in Germany. James said nothing. When I inherited the company, I inherited everything that came with it, including the Meridian system, including whatever decisions were made around it. She paused. I didn't know your name until 6 weeks ago. What happened 6 weeks ago? She reached into her bag and produced a folder. She set it on the table between them and didn't open it, just left it there. I found a discrepancy in the original development records. The filing dates on the internal R&D documentation didn't align with the project timeline. When I started pulling the earlier records, I found a gap, about 14 months of development history that was attributed to a team project with no individual engineer identified. That's an interesting gap. It is. And when I went to the personnel records to find who was leading the project during that period, I found that the lead engineer's file had been sealed under a termination classification that restricted access. James looked at the folder on the table. My father's legal team processed it, she said. At the time, I understand you signed an NDA as part of your severance. I signed it because I had a 6-year-old at home and a mortgage, and I'd already spent 3 months trying to find a lawyer who'd take the case without a retainer I couldn't afford. He said it plainly, without bitterness. The way you state a fact you've had a long time to make peace with. Fighting it was a luxury I didn't have. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the folder. Inside was a single page, a photocopy of something handwritten. The paper yellowed slightly at the edges. She slid it across the table. James looked at it. It was a letter, written in the careful, slanted script of someone who had grown up writing by hand before keyboards made it optional. The letterhead was a personal notepad, not company stationery. The date was 14 months ago, 3 weeks before Robert Caldwell died. He read it slowly. It was addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone in general, written in the way of a man working through something he hadn't fully resolved. Robert Caldwell wrote about the Meridian system. He wrote about the development history. He wrote, in the 3rd paragraph, a name, James Holt. He wrote, I've been trying to understand how the attribution record became what it is. I've been told it was a matter of internal policy around proprietary development. I'm no longer certain that explanation is complete. The original work came from somewhere. It came from someone. I should have asked more questions before I didn't. The last line read, If I'm wrong about this, it costs me nothing to correct it. If I'm right, it costs someone everything that I don't. James read it twice. Then he set it down on the table and sat quietly for a moment with his hands flat on the surface. He wrote this before he died, James said. 3 weeks before. I found it in his personal files. I don't think he showed it to anyone. She paused. I don't think he had the chance to do anything about it. Who handled my termination? In the company's chain of command. Who processed it? Audrey's expression didn't shift, but something in her eyes did. Gerald Fitch. He was the chief operating officer for 13 years. He's still with the company. James recognized the name the way you recognize the name of a weather system that destroyed something you built. I know that name. I thought you might. Gerald Fitch had been the specific gravity of everything that had gone wrong, not loudly. That was the thing about Fitch. He was never loud. He praised James's work in team meetings with a particular warmth that suggested pride, and then systematically ensured that the work, when it was referenced upward, was referenced as a collective achievement. He'd been the one to tell James, when James raised concerns about the attribution process, that documentation of that nature was handled by legal. And legal had their reasons, and it wasn't something for engineers to get exercised about. He'd been the one who processed the termination paperwork 3 weeks after James filed a formal complaint about the attribution record. The timing had not been a coincidence. "Is there documentation?" James said. "Between Fitch and whoever made the decision to structure my termination the way it was structured?" Audrey slid another page across the table. "I've spent 6 weeks pulling files. The termination classification you were processed under requires executive authorization. Fitch signed it. The authorization chain traces upward from his office." She tapped the page. "My father's signature isn't on anything related to your case, which either means he didn't know or he knew and kept his distance from the paperwork." "The letter suggests he didn't know." "Yes," Audrey said. "It does." James looked at the letter again. He looked at a man he'd never met trying to work out, in longhand on a personal notepad 3 weeks before he died, how something wrong had happened inside something he'd built. He thought about the voicemail he'd left his own lawyer 6 months after the termination, the one where he'd said he was done trying, that he was moving on, that he had a daughter to raise and a life to build, and he couldn't keep spending energy on something that wasn't going to change. He picked up his coffee. It had gone lukewarm. "What do you want from me?" he said. "I want to know what actually happened," Audrey said, "and then I want to correct the record. Correcting the record doesn't put back 3 years. "No," she said, "it doesn't." She held his eyes. "I'm not here to tell you it does." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. She had the particular steadiness of someone who had prepared for this conversation and had decided to say the true things rather than the convenient ones. "Fitch is still at the company," James said. "Yes, and you're the CEO." "Yes." "Then this conversation is happening because you've decided to do something about it, not just understand it." Something shifted in her face. "I've been running my father's company for 11 months, and I've been running it the way he ran it, which means trusting the people he trusted and deferring to the systems he built. I've been doing that because I was 29 years old, and I'd spent 3 months handling a funeral and an estate and a board of directors who looked at me like I was a problem to be managed." She paused. "What I found in those files 6 weeks ago is the first time I've had reason to question whether trusting those systems was the right call." James was quiet. "Fitch controls the facilities division," she said. "The Meridian system falls under his oversight. He's had access to the revenue data, the performance reports, everything. Whatever his reasons were 3 years ago for handling your termination the way he did. He had a financial interest in the diagnostic contract staying internal," James said. "No individual attribution meant no independent claim. If the system remained company property with no external inventor of record, the licensing structure stayed clean." "Simpler." Audrey looked at him. "You worked that out. I've had 3 years. Can you document it?" "Not directly, but you have access to the financial records I don't. If Fitch had a compensation arrangement tied to the Meridian system's commercial performance." "He did," she said quietly. "It's in the files. A performance bonus structure tied to the facilities division's cost savings, which the Meridian system has been generating for 2 years. James set his mug down. The number 11.4 million sat between them without being said. "What do you need from me?" he said again. But the question had a different weight now. "Everything you have from the original development period. Notes, drafts, anything that establishes the timeline and authorship. I have what's in the company's records. I need what's in yours. My records are in boxes in the back of this garage." She blinked. "You kept them." "I kept everything." He said it without apology. "I didn't know if I'd ever need it, but I kept it." He went to the back of the garage and came back with a cardboard box, one of 8. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside were notebooks, engineering notebooks, the kind with the graph paper pages and the sewn binding that serious engineers use because they can't be altered without it showing, and printed files and handwritten calculations on loose paper that he'd kept in order with rubber bands and labeled tabs. 3 years of original development work, time-stamped and documented with the precision of someone who knew, even while he was doing it, that the documentation might one day matter. Audrey looked at the box for a moment. Then she looked at him. You built the whole thing yourself, she said. The core, yes. The implementation needed a team. That part was collaborative. The architecture was mine. She reached out and touched the edge of one of the notebooks, not opening it, just acknowledging it. I'd like to bring our legal team to you. Not Caldwell's internal counsel. Outside attorneys, nobody connected to Fitch's division. I need to build a complete record before I take this to the board. When you take it to the board, James said, Fitch is going to call it a hostile action. He's been there 13 years. He has people. I know. He'll say the attribution record reflects established company policy. He'll say any development work done under a company contract belongs to the company. He will, she said, and I'll have your notebooks. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the October light was doing what October light did in Ohio, going flat and golden across the gravel lot, making everything look briefly more resolved than it was. There's something else, James said. The letter. Audrey nodded. He wrote that he should have asked more questions. Your father. Before he didn't. Yes, that matters to me. Not because it changes anything that happened, but because I spent 3 years not knowing whether the man who built Caldwell knew what was done in his company's name. He paused. The letter tells me he didn't, or that he found out and was trying to fix it. Audrey's expression was very composed, and also, underneath the composure, very tired, in the way of someone who has been maintaining something that costs. He was better at the work than he was at telling people what the work meant to him, she said. I know that better than most. James didn't ask her to explain. He understood the shape of what she meant without needing the details. I'll get you the boxes, he said. Sophie appeared in the doorway of the garage at 5:15 with the uncanny timing she had for moments when the adult conversation was finishing. She looked at Audrey with the direct assessment she brought to all new people and said, Are you staying for dinner? Sophie, James said. It's a reasonable question. It's almost 5:30. Audrey looked at Sophie, and then at James, and then back at Sophie. Something in her expression loosened slightly. I don't want to impose. Dad makes too much pasta, Sophie said. He always makes too much. It's a problem. I don't make too much pasta, James said. Last Tuesday, we ate it for 3 days. Audrey's mouth curved just slightly. I can stay for a little while, she said, if that's all right. James looked at his daughter, who had the expression of someone who had asked a question and expected it to be honored. He looked at Audrey, who was watching him with the cautious openness of someone who had come to do something difficult and had found it slightly different from what she'd prepared for. We're having pasta, he said. They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them, with the overhead light on because it got dark early now. And Sophie talked about her history project, which was about Ohio river towns, and Audrey asked 2 genuine questions about it that made Sophie look up from her food with an expression of pleasurable surprise. James made too much pasta. He did not comment on this. After Sophie went to do her homework, James and Audrey sat with their coffee, and she told him more about what she'd found in the files. The performance bonus, the contract structure, the gap in the development records that her junior analyst had flagged as a formatting anomaly and that had turned out to be the corner of something much larger. She talked about it the way engineers talk about problems, linearly, with evidence, without dramatizing the parts that were already dramatic on their own. You're going to take this to the board yourself, James said. Yes, without warning Fitch first. Giving him warning gives him time to manage the documentation. The documentation is what this case stands on. She paused. He'll have legal representation. He'll have arguments. What I'm not willing to give him is a head start. James looked at her. She was 29 years old, 30 now, maybe, and she was planning to walk into a boardroom and present evidence that the man who'd run her father's company for 13 years had been committing fraud. She was doing it carefully and without drama and with the particular determination of someone who had decided that the right thing and the necessary thing were the same thing and had stopped looking for reasons to delay. The board is going to ask what you want, she said. In terms of resolution, what you're looking for. Attribution, James said. The development record corrected to accurately reflect who built the system. Patent filings updated. My name on the work I did. He paused. And the compensation that was withheld when my contract was terminated for a cause that was manufactured. She nodded. That's completely reasonable. All of it. I'm not looking to destabilize Caldwell, he said. The company employs a lot of people who had nothing to do with what Fitch did. Whatever happens to him should be surgical, targeted. It shouldn't blow up the company to get to one man. Audrey looked at him steadily. That's a generous position for someone in your situation. It's the right position, he said. Those aren't always the same thing, but in this case they are. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want you to know something. The letter my father wrote, the part where he says he should have asked more questions. She paused. I've been thinking about that since I found it, because it's also true of me. I came into that company and I trusted the people he trusted, and I moved fast, and I didn't ask enough questions about the systems I was running. The Meridian Diagnostic, I've been presenting its performance data to the board for 11 months. I've said our proprietary system in 6 investor presentations. I didn't know it was wrong, but I also didn't look closely enough to know it was right. James said nothing. That's not an excuse, she said. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the full shape of it. He looked at his coffee. At the table where they'd had dinner, at the kitchen of the house he'd built in the 3 years since Caldwell, which was modest and slightly cluttered, and had a drawing on the refrigerator that Sophie had made at age 7 of the 2 of them, standing in front of the garage. My wife died when Sophie was 5, he said. It came out the way things come out when you've decided to say them rather than choosing the moment carefully. 8 months before Caldwell let me go. She was sick for a year before that. Audrey went very still. I'm not telling you for sympathy, he said. I'm telling you because the timing of what Fitch did, the termination, the way it was structured, the NDA, all of it, it happened at the worst possible time. By design or by coincidence, I still don't know. But that's when I had the least capacity to fight back, and that's when it happened. I'm sorry, Audrey said, and it came out without the professional coding that her words usually carried. Just 2 words. Plain. Thank you, he said. They sat quietly for a moment. Sophie's voice drifted down from upstairs, talking to herself the way she did when she was working through a problem, a low, continuous murmur that had been part of the background noise of his life since she was 3. The board meeting is in 2 weeks, Audrey said eventually. I want to be ready before I move. I'll have the boxes organized by the end of the week. Full timeline, annotated. The legal team can cross-reference against whatever's in Caldwell's internal records. Okay. She stood and picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. Mr. Holt, James. She paused. James, whatever happens in that boardroom, I want you to know that this is already going differently than I thought it would. How did you think it would go? I thought you'd be angrier. He considered that. I'm not angry, he said. I was for a long time, but anger doesn't maintain well without somewhere to put it, and I had Sophie in the garage and more useful things to do with my days. He paused. What I am is interested in the record being accurate. That's different from anger. It's more durable. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was carefully neutral, and also, underneath the careful neutrality, something else. Recognition, maybe. I'll be in touch, she said. He walked her out to the gravel lot. Her car looked the way expensive cars look against a backdrop of garage grease and Ohio October, slightly from another world, but not uncomfortably so. She got in. She didn't pull out immediately, sat for a moment, and he had the impression she was writing something on her phone. He went back inside. Sophie was at the kitchen table when he came in, nominally doing homework, actually waiting. Is she coming back? Sophie said. Probably. Is she nice? James thought about the letter on the table, about a woman who'd driven 2 hours to a garage in Millhaven to tell a man she'd never met that her father had known he was wronged. He thought about the way she'd asked Sophie about the River Towns project with actual interest, not the performed interest of adults indulging children, but the real kind. She's working on something hard, he said. She's taking it seriously. Sophie absorbed this. That's its own kind of nice, she said, with the offhand certainty of a 9-year-old who had learned to mean what she said. James sat down at the table across from her. Homework, he said. I'm doing it. Do it more. She made a face that said she saw directly through him, which she did, and went back to her worksheet. He sat there for a moment in the kitchen of the house he'd made from 3 years of smaller expectations and daily work, and he thought about 8 cardboard boxes in the back of his garage, full of everything he'd built and documented and kept, because something had told him, even then, to keep it. He thought about what it would mean to have his name on his own work. Not for himself exactly. He knew what he'd built. He'd known for 3 years, in the specific way that people know things they can't prove, which is a harder kind of knowing than the kind that comes with documentation. But for Sophie, for the record, for the fact that the truth was in those boxes and had been in those boxes the whole time, patient as anything, waiting for someone to come looking. The board meeting was on a Thursday. James didn't attend. He'd offered, and Audrey had said she'd call him if she needed him present, and she'd said it in the tone of someone who didn't expect to need him, which he'd taken as a reasonable professional judgment rather than a dismissal. He went to work. He fixed a transmission on a Ford F-150. He replaced a water pump on an old Subaru that belonged to a woman named Erica, who taught 7th grade and had been bringing her car to him for 2 years and always left exact change in an envelope on the seat, because she decided once that this was the correct system. Audrey called at 2:17. "It's done," she said. He set down his wrench. "What does done mean?" "Fitch is suspended pending investigation, 8 votes to 3. The board also voted to correct the Meridian development record. Formal attribution. Your name as lead engineer. Patent filings updated." A pause. "The compensation question is still being worked out through legal, but it's not disputed. It's a matter of structure and timeline, not whether it's owed." He stood in the middle of his garage for a moment. The October light was coming through the side window at the angle that meant it was mid-afternoon. "He didn't fight it," James said. "He fought it," she said. "He was very composed about it. He said the attribution record reflected established policy, that the development work was conducted under a company contract, that any letter from my father was the incomplete work of a man who was operating on limited information." She paused. "Then I put the notebooks on the table." "Which notebooks?" "Yours. Copies of them. The full annotated timeline." The board read the dates. James said nothing. "Dates don't argue," Audrey said. "That's the thing about actual documentation. It just sits there and is true." He almost smiled. "What happens to him now?" "Investigation. Legal review of the performance bonus structure, the financial arrangements. The Attorney General's office will receive a referral. That's not my decision. That's the board's legal obligation once certain thresholds are crossed." She paused. "It will take time. These things take time. I know. But it's out of the building now. It's not internal anymore." James stood with his phone in the middle of his garage and thought about a woman in a parking lot in October asking to talk about the Meridian project. He thought about a letter written by a man who was trying to correct something before he ran out of time. He thought about 8 notebooks in a cardboard box, the dates on them earlier than any date in Caldwell's internal records by 14 months, the kind of fact that doesn't become more or less true depending on what anyone says about it. "James?" Audrey said. "Yeah. Thank you for keeping the notebooks." "I always figured the truth was in there," he said. "I just needed someone to come look for it." Sophie took the news with the particular calm she brought to things that confirmed what she'd already decided was true. She was at the kitchen table when he told her, doing homework she'd actually been assigned that week, and she listened to the summary he gave her. Simplified but not dishonest. And then she said, "So your name is on it now. The real record. That's the process." "Yeah. Good," she said, with the completeness of someone for whom this was the answer that mattered, and went back to her homework. He made dinner. He made less pasta than usual, which Sophie noticed and did not comment on, which meant she was paying him a very specific kind of respect. Audrey came back to Millhaven twice in November. The first time was about documentation. Her legal team needed clarifications on 2 of the notebooks, technical questions that James answered at the workbench, while Sophie did homework on the stool she'd claimed as hers by consistent use. The second time had toe-stated reason, which was its own kind of reason. She brought coffee from a place on the highway she'd stopped at on the way, and she sat on the spare stool and asked him about the garage, about how the work was different from engineering, about whether he missed the scale of what he'd done at Caldwell. "Sometimes," he said. "The architecture of it, the way all the parts had to talk to each other. He was working on a boat motor that belonged to a man named Henry who needed it by December. But scale brings things with it. Politics. People who care more about who gets credit than whether the thing actually works. And small scale doesn't have that. Henry doesn't care who gets credit for his boat motor running," James said. "He just wants it to run." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That sounds clarifying." It is. The Fitch investigation moved the way these things moved, deliberately, with the grinding thoroughness of a process that couldn't be hurried without becoming vulnerable. The criminal referral went to the state attorney general's office in January. The financial review of the performance bonus structure confirmed what the records had suggested. Fitch's compensation arrangement had generated approximately $3.2 million in bonuses tied to the Meridian system's performance over 2 years, while the man who'd built the system was running a garage in Millhaven and making too much pasta. James read the number in a document Audrey's legal team sent him. He sat with it for a while. He thought about what 3 years of certainty without documentation cost, about the specific weight of knowing something you can't prove, about the way it had lived in him through the work of building the garage and raising Sophie and doing what needed to be done, because the doing was the thing he could control. He filed the document in a box. He went back to work. The formal attribution correction was announced in February. A press release from Caldwell Precision Engineering acknowledging the Meridian diagnostic system as the original work of James Holt, lead engineer, with full patent attribution updated accordingly. It was not dramatic. It ran in 2 industry publications and 1 technology newsletter, and was read by the specific people who would understand its significance, which was the right number of people, a reporter called. James talked to her for 20 minutes. He answered the technical questions about the system, how it worked, what frequency signatures it read, why the algorithm was structured the way it was. He didn't characterize his feelings about 3 years of working out of a garage in Ohio. She wrote an article that got the system right and got the timeline approximately right, and called him a quiet engineer who preferred his work to speak for itself, which was not exactly wrong. Sophie read it and said, "They spelled your name right." "That's the important thing," James said. She gave him the look she gave him when she thought he was being deflecting, and she had decided to let it go. It was her mother's look. He recognized it every time. Audrey restructured the company's leadership in the spring. She delegated more than she had before, distributed the oversight that she'd been holding herself, because she hadn't trusted anyone else to hold it, and hadn't trusted her own judgment about who to trust. She told James about it on a Saturday in April, sitting on the stool in the garage while he worked on an engine for a man named Davis, who had brought in a car so neglected it constituted a kind of optimism. "My father ran it himself," she said. "Everything central. Trusted a few people who'd been there long enough to earn it and kept everything else close. I was doing the same thing, because it was the template you had," James said, "and because I was afraid of making his mistakes. So I was making different ones." She paused. The Fitch situation made that clear. "Trusting the wrong person isn't the same mistake as not trusting anyone," James said. "No," she said. "Different mistake, same root." He set down his tool and looked at her. "Which is," she considered it, "not believing your own read of people." He trusted Fitch because Fitch had been there and knew the language of loyalty. "I didn't trust anyone because I'd seen what that cost him." A pause. "You need your own judgment to work, not your father's, not his mistakes in reverse. Yours." She said it like she was still working it out, which he thought was probably accurate. He went back to Davis's engine. She was in Millhaven most weekends by summer. She had a coffee order at the diner on Main Street that the woman behind the counter knew without asking. And she had, as James had predicted to no one in particular, been absorbed into the town with the efficient matter-of-factness that small towns applied to people who showed up consistently and without pretension. She and James were not a story with a defined shape. They were something earlier than that. 2 people who had come through something together and had found that they wanted to stay near each other, which was both simpler and more complicated than stories usually presented. They were careful with each other in the way of people who understood that care wasn't the same as caution, and who had both had the experience of building something that mattered and watching it require more protection than they'd known to give it at the time. Sophie had opinions about this. She delivered them sideways, in the manner she'd inherited from someone who was no longer here to deliver them directly. James listened to these opinions and offered no confirming information, which Sophie accepted with the patience of someone who believed she was right and was content to wait. One evening in August, Sophie came into the garage with 2 mugs of tea, oversteeped, the way she always made it, in the manner of someone who had learned a skill and deployed it regularly without refining it. She climbed onto her stool. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "The Davis engine." He was doing finish work, calibration details. "Why?" "You have the face you make when you're thinking about something real, but it's not a problem." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the directness she'd been looking at him with since she was old enough to look at things directly. "I was thinking about the day the boxes came back," he said. 3 years ago. When I left Caldwell. And thinking about the fact that I kept all of it, the notebooks, the drafts. I wasn't sure at the time if I was being practical or just not ready to let go." He paused. Turns out it didn't matter which one. The keeping was what mattered. Sophie wrapped both hands around her mug. "Do you think things happen for a reason?" He considered it the way he considered her questions, as things that deserved actual thought. "I think things happen," he said, "and then you decide what to do with them. And the deciding is where the meaning is." She sat with that for a moment, with the seriousness she brought to things she actually cared about. "That's a good answer," she said. "Did you just come up with it?" "I've been working on it for a while," he said. She smiled. Her mother's smile, his stubbornness behind it, the particular combination that was entirely her own, and drank her tea, and they sat in the comfortable quiet of the garage, in the town that was their town, as the summer evening settled around them without requirement or condition. His name was on the work now. The record said what was true. And the man who had built something real, in the years when he had no way to prove it, had a daughter who made oversteeped tea and asked him the right questions, and a garage with a slightly crooked sign, and a life that was not the one he'd planned, but was, in all the ways that turned out to matter, the one he'd made. That was enough. It was, he had slowly learned, more than enough, and between those two things, there was no distance at all.